Britain's conversation.
Isn't it funny? You know, when I came here 17 years ago, and I said that I wanted to lead a campaign to get Britain to leave the European Union, you all laughed at me. Well, I have to say, you're not laughing now, are you? I don't want to be rude, but you have the charisma of a damp rag and the appearance of a low-grade bank clerk. Let June the 23rd go down in our history as our Independence Day. When you yourself, Mr. Van Rompuy, say that the euro has brought us stability, I could applaud you for having a sense of humour. Yes, I want you sacked, Mr. Schultz, as well. I want you all fired.
Nigel Farage.
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 The Nigel Farage Show on LBC.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. I'm back in London. And today, Lord Neuberger, the President of our Supreme Court, spoke out. He said that he felt over the Brexit decision, not enough people had been prepared to stand up and defend the judiciary. Where were his friends amongst the political class? This is what he said.
What they did was perfectly lawful. But I think some of the things that were said risked undermining the judiciary and unfairly undermining the judiciary and therefore undermining the rule of law. If you have a free press, these things can happen. And to pretend it's the end of civilization as we know it when it happens once or twice is wrong. If it became standard practice, then I'd be worried. So far as the decision in this court, the Supreme Court, is concerned, the politicians reacted, and particularly government ministers reacted with exemplary speed and said exactly what, in my view, they should have said. When the divisional court had given its judgment before, I think that the politicians acted slower than one would have hoped and perhaps expressed themselves rather more pallidly than one would have hoped. But to be fair to politicians, like judges, they learn, and after the Supreme Court gave its decision, they did precisely what they should have done. We were doing what our job requires us to do, which was taking a case which had been brought to court and dealing with it according to the law and answering the issues that were presented to us according to the law. And to say that makes us out of touch, I think misses the whole point of our function, which is to uphold the rule of law.
Well, it wasn't so much the Supreme Court, Lord Neuberger, that got criticised, it was the High Court. And it was the High Court that said that actually the referendum wasn't good enough, it didn't count, even though the government had told us it would, this would have to be decided by Parliament. And yes, the next day, the Daily Mail carried a big headline with a picture of the three judges concerned, with the headline, "Enemies of the People," which I guess was pretty out there. And to be fair, I was pretty critical too, and I was critical in particular of one of the judges, Lord Thomas, and the reason was that he had clearly been an activist for us to be integrated fully within the European legal system, and I felt it would have been better if he'd absented himself from the case. So this isn't just about the Supreme Court, and actually it isn't just about the High Court. The bigger fundamental question I'm asking you today is, should judges be off limits when it comes to us criticising their decisions? Because pretty clearly Lord Neuberger's saying in that clip, if you stayed awake for it, that what he's saying is that if you criticise judges, you're undermining the rule of law. And I'm sorry, I just don't buy into that. I think any public servant is there to be criticised for how they act or what they do. Surely it can't be right that politicians can be criticised for virtually everything they do, and yet judges should be effectively exempt. The Lord Chancellor and Justice Minister Liz Truss said after his speech this morning that she was delighted that Lord Neuberger was proactively talking about the role of the judiciary in public. Right. Well, I'm none the wiser as to what she thinks, whether she agrees with what he was saying or not. But I want to know from you. I want to know from Tony in Wakefield. Tony, was it wrong that the Daily Mail and myself and some others, was it wrong that we criticised one of those judges in particular and that decision in the High Court over Brexit?
Yes, ultimately. The reason being is can I just say to you, Nigel, thank you very much for getting us to this situation, because I believe you did, and without you I don't think we'd be where we are.
Well, that's very sweet of you, Tony, but what about these judges?
Going back to the judges, I think in this case, look, one of our problems in this country, and one of the reasons that Heath was able to drag us into the EU without asking the people first, because we weren't asked until 2 years after we joined it,
Sure.
is because we have an unwritten constitution. Now, anybody who's ever been anywhere near a law school in this country, and there's quite a lot of us, will tell you that the one thing they always talk about is our wonderfully flexible constitution. That means they can fiddle with it. That's what it means. And the problem is when you're in uncharted territory like this, what you find is nobody's really sure who has the power to do what. And what judges were doing in that case was determining what the law says. Now, of course, or their interpretation of it, because, of course, we've never been down this road before. And, of course, we all know that treaties have been ratified using the royal prerogative since the dawn of time, but basically. And this is why the government believed that they could use the royal prerogative to invoke Article 50, because it was part of the day-to-day management of the treaties. And somebody sort of said, well, is that the case? And the judges decided not. I think that the government should have been able to do it, but, you know...
Well, Tony, I did too. I mean, on the point of law, because although Parliament approved the government back in 1972 of being able to sign the Treaty of Rome, it was actually put into law using the royal prerogative. But, you know, I'll tell you something, Tony, I have become a convert to the idea of us having a written constitution. Yes, I have. However, even with a written constitution, as in America, it still doesn't leave things completely cut and dried. There are still differences of opinion. Tony, my point, when I was as critical as I was of the High Court, my point was this. It was that Lord Chief Justice Thomas had spent many years of his career pursuing the idea of us being fully integrated into EU law. And just as, I mean, Tony, if you appeared in court and I was on the jury, I'd have to say, I'm sorry, I can't be on the jury for this case. I know Tony. I know what a rotter he is already. And surely, shouldn't it be the same for judges? Surely if they have an interest or a background that conflicts them over a case, wouldn't it perhaps have been better if he'd resiled himself from making this judgment?
The legal principle is nemo judex in sua causa. No man shall sit in judgment in his own cause.
Yes.
And I think, had he been wise, he would have stood down.
Yes.
And I think from that point of view, perhaps you were right to criticise. However, what I'm really meaning was the headlines about enemies of the people. Judges are not enemies of the people, although some of them were probably ardent, fast Remainers. But they're not enemies of the people. They're merely interpreting the law. That's what they're supposed to do. We may not agree all the time in the way they've interpreted the law,
okay,
but I'm prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt.
So, Tony, your point is that actually those attacks were a bit over the top. No, thank you very much indeed for the points you've made. Barry in Harrow, is it right? Should we be able to criticise the judiciary?
It's a very dangerous precedent, is my answer to you, Nigel. One of the important aspects of democracy is that the executive, which are the politicians, and the judiciary are separate. Mm-hmm. And the executive should not be allowed to put pressure on the judiciary. Political systems that have that kind of pressure have existed in the past, like Nazi Germany, and they exist in other parts of the world where there's no proper legal system in a country like China. So I think the unaccountable, the third estate, like the Daily Mail, who Stanley Baldwin described as harlots, have to be very careful in stirring up public pressure to attack judges. Judges are interpreting the law. It's up to politicians to change the law if they feel the law is wrong.
On the big picture, Barry, of course, everything you've said there is absolutely right. But the broader point, I mean, surely in your lifetime you've read in newspapers about judgments or comments that judges perhaps have made that you would think, goodness me, where on earth did they get that from?
Yes, there have been cases where I think there was a case a few years ago in the criminal court. I think it was a rape case where a judge made a very ridiculous comment about the victim and quite rightly I think in those days it was the Lord Chancellor's Department,
Yes.
dealt with it. But that's not what this case was about. What the Daily Mail was doing was attacking the judiciary for interpreting this case about the referendum and its impact and who should decide it. And that is a major constitutional issue. And if we don't have separation of powers, Nigel, God help us.
Yeah, no, Barry, I get that. I understand that. And, of course, traditionally, our judiciary has been very much less political than, say, America, you know, where they are political appointments. There are some, Barry, that would say that maybe during the Blair years we did see an increasing politicisation of bits of our judiciary, and some even view the establishment of the Supreme Court in that light. But Barry, your basic point that pressure should not be put by the executive on the judiciary and they need to be separated is, of course, fundamental and correct. And I thank you very much for the call. Text here, there's a big difference between criticism and emotional splurges making headlines, says Kate. Robert in Sittingbourne says the judiciary are getting too big for their boots and characters like Lord Neuberger should not be making public political statements. Well, I think, Robert, he would argue, actually, that he wasn't. And a tweet here, all holders of power must be scrutinised, even criticised by the public. And that point is made by Matthew Hatch. And I wonder what John, living in Ashton-under-Hill, makes of this debate.
Good evening, Nigel. Thanks for having me on. The point I wanted to make was that throughout the whole of the history of the 18th and 19th century common law in tort and contract, property rights always trumped human rights. Almost all the time, and then of course, if you, which was the country where the property was, crimes against property were absolutely not on, and then of course you have the supreme example of Judge Jeffreys, who was definitely an enemy of the people, who eventually found his lot in the Glorious Revolution. Not too different from June the 23rd.
So, John, judges can get things wrong and we should criticise them. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely right.
Yes.
Because they are creatures of their time. And the other point I'd like to make, Nigel, is we actually do have a written constitution. It's written in case law. It's just not codified like the wretched Code Napoleon.
No, and that's the argument against written constitutions, and I do understand that, John, and I've wrestled with this myself, but when I look at the US Constitution, I do think at least they've got some better basic frameworks for knowing what a law actually might be. Ours, yes, it is written, but you couldn't even fit it into this studio. John, I thank you. Your Facebook messages. Malcolm Lucas says, judges work for the public and therefore are subject to criticisms. Glenys Dillon says, no one is above the law, and those that intimidate people doing their job should be prosecuted. Well, OK, you can read that any way you want. As we speak, President Trump is giving a press conference in Washington of quite a dramatic nature. I'll be giving you the latest in a moment on what he's been saying. But right now, you're listening to The Nigel Farage Show exclusively on LBC. It's 7:15.
This is LBC, The Nigel Farage Show. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Tweet at LBC using the hashtag Farage on LBC.
Britain's senior judge, Lord Neuberger, has said today that it's unfair, the level of criticism that was thrown at the judiciary in the wake of the High Court ruling on Brexit, saying the decision had to go back to Parliament. And I'm asking, are judges completely above and beyond criticism? And a text here says, pompous judges and lawyers should be prodded occasionally by the press. That's from Richard. They are human beings, subject to human error. So yes, they should be open to evaluation and criticism, says Dave H. As a lawyer myself and a Leave voter, I think we can rely on judges to be legally impartial. Lord Justice Thomas would have been wiser to stand down, but the Daily Mail over-egged the pudding. Stuart from Wiltshire. Well, that was the point, Stuart, that I was making. I felt that in the case of this individual, just as a juror could not possibly sit on a case knowing the accused, that the same should have applied here. But I'm going to go further with this idea that judges should be open to criticism. I think, actually, they should be open to an even greater level of scrutiny. You know, it was only back in 1975 that we first put proceedings in the House of Commons on the radio. And it wasn't televised until the late 1980s. And now we would think it absurd, surely, if we could not see, Prime Minister's questions or whatever it was. We want to see and hear what is going on in that chamber. Now, we do televise the proceedings of the Supreme Court, but more often than not, they are pretty high, complex points of law. But I'm going to suggest that not only should we be able to criticise judges in some cases, not to attempt to destroy the independence of the judiciary, but to criticise them in some cases. And I think, just as we do in America and other countries, I think trials in this country, Crown Court trials and upwards, should be televised, should be covered properly by the media, so we can make our own minds up whether the money we spend, it's your money, you're paying it as taxpayers, whether that money is being spent on the right people. And that's my suggestion. I think even more transparency would be an idea. You may agree with that, you may disagree with that. Either way, to get involved, call me on 0345 60 60 973. Text me at 84850. You can tweet me at LBC, not forgetting the hashtag Farage and LBC. And you can watch the show live on LB's Facebook page. Now, Adrian in Islington, what do you think of this debate?
What I think is I'd much rather have the rule of law rather than the rule of Farage soundbites or Trump soundbites in their respective countries. And, we've had 3 different layers of law here. So I don't mind them being challenged on a point of law.
Yep.
That's fine. But to be criticised by people like you on an evening show with your audience, nearly all of us will be inexpert in this. And to have this crucifixion by media is completely wrong. If you want to challenge them, then by all means hire a lawyer and take it on a point of law.
Well, actually,
but
Adrian,
trying to crucify them on the radio, get people wound up because they disagree, because 3 different layers of judges, all of whom are legal experts, happen to disagree with you. By the way, I don't think you'd be protesting if they had done what you would have wanted.
Well, Adrian,
I'd rather have rule of law than the rule of Farage soundbite.
Adrian, you can do your Farage soundbites bit, and it all sounds very good. But at least I've been consistent. I said from the start that I thought it was very, very questionable that Lord Thomas should have been part of that High Court ruling, given his own interest in this subject. Surely that's a reasonable point to make.
Well, maybe, but do you imagine that all of those judges, right? They are senior people. They will all have been very aware of current affairs. They'll all have watched that debate going along, all the way along the line. I can't believe that any one of those judges didn't have an opinion, one way or the other, on whether we should stay in or whether we should leave. So all of them will have had an opinion. The mere fact that one of them happens to have made it public doesn't necessarily invalidate him as an individual. Do you think any of the others would have failed to have had an opinion? The fact that they kept it secret, for all you know, Nigel, or for I know, for all we know, multiple judges may have been people minded to leave, or there may have been people minded to stay, but they didn't declare it. So in that sense, every one of them, I'm sure, had an opinion.
Well, I think there's a difference, Adrian. Adrian, there's a difference between having a private opinion and being a public campaigner for something. But I'm going to go further, Adrian, in my criticism here, and let me tell you why I feel strongly about this. And actually, now I will criticise Lord Neuberger himself, and here's why. After that High Court judgment and the decision that it would go to the Supreme Court, UKIP, the only party in this country that has believed and campaigned for Brexit, and without whom I don't think anybody thinks there would have been a referendum, we, Adrian, applied, we made an application to the Supreme Court to put our case, to put our point of law, which very simply would have been that as the Treaty of Rome came into being using royal prerogative, surely the same should apply here. And do you know what, Adrian? The Supreme Court refused to take us, refused to hear our points.
By the way, Nigel, did you apply to the lower courts?
No, we didn't, because by this time
Why not? Well, hang on. Why would it not have been equally relevant for you to apply to the other courts? Why wait for the Supreme Court? Why couldn't you do that?
Because it had already gone to the Supreme Court, and that is why.
Well, why didn't you apply? Because I'm 3 layers, hasn't it? So why didn't you apply at the first layer, appealing to the appeals court? Why didn't you put your case to the next level?
Because we're a political party. We don't want to spend our lives on legal fees.
You want to do it now. You're a political party. Why is doing it Supreme Court any different to doing it at the next level?
Because we barely, to be honest with you, this went pretty much very quickly. Adrian, I think it's and I am questioning. Do you know what? I am questioning the genuine independence of our Supreme Court if they weren't prepared to take a deposition from the one political party who had a real interest in Brexit and had done for nearly 25 years. Adrian, thank you for your passionately made points and criticisms. The Farage soundbite. Gosh, how awful. Kevin in Bromley. Should judges be above all forms of criticism?
No, most definitely not. But first of all, I'd like to thank you for getting us out of the clutches of the European Union protection racket.
Well, Kevin, we've won a referendum. Won a referendum, but we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, we're on the way, though. We're on the way. We've got a chance now to escape from that protection racket. But now moving to the question at hand. Quite definitely, they should be scrutinised and criticised. If you don't do that, you undermine democracy and the rule of law.
Yes.
It needs to be safeguarded. Those judges, those particular judges, the High Court judges and the Supreme Court judges, they are extremely clever men, fully conversant with the law. But what you've got to bear in mind is they are part of the establishment, they are part of the elite, and the bulk of them are pro-Europe. They rule on the European law because the real Supreme Court at the moment is the European.
Well, that's certainly true. It's certainly true that since we originally signed up to the Treaty of Rome, our courts, of course, can have their judgment struck down in both Luxembourg and indeed in Strasbourg too. But your point, Kevin, is interesting because what Lord Neuberger...
Another point, Nigel.
Just one second. What Lord Neuberger was saying was that if you criticise the judges, you undermine the rule of law, and your point is if you don't criticise at times, that actually undermines the rule of law even more deeply.
Of course it does. And I'll make this point. The point I really want to make is they are part of the elite and they're pro-European. And judges don't just interpret the law, they actually alter the law and make law. They often find, they'll set a precedent.
Well...
So they could... those people are so clever. If they'd have been anti-European, I'm sure they would have found a way to set a precedent and would have said something like, this is a unique situation because of this and because of that, blah, 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 blah.
Well, one thing, Kevin, is for certain. Whether they
could do that.
Kevin, whether they were for or against, I don't know. But one thing is for certain, that Lord Neuberger wanted, when it went to the Supreme Court, for it to be a unanimous decision, and it wasn't. It was a split decision. Kevin, I thank you for your call very much. I'm going to go to Carl in Orpington next. Carl, what do you make of this?
Yeah, well, hi, Nigel. Thanks for taking the call. I just wanted to say that, really, there are procedures in which you can challenge judicial kind of activity. And I really... what it does is undermine our system if we're just constantly beating them up outside of that judicial complaints procedure. It undermines the judiciary, it undermines our country, and you're naturally an obstructionist. You've been that way for many, many years. You obstructed Europe, and now we're out of Europe, and, OK, we all have to accept it. But the point is that you bit on their heels all day long, every day, until you got what you want. But we don't want you to destroy the country. In that way, and I think if there are procedures for dealing with judicial complaints, let's follow the procedures. Let's go through it. If you want to lodge a complaint against Judge Nuremberg, then lodge a complaint against Judge Nuremberg, but put it in the right forum.
Well, I tried, Carl. But Carl, I tried. We tried as a party to make a deposition to that Supreme Court hearing, and they wouldn't listen to us. Can you see why we're a little bit upset?
Well, then obviously that your complaint wasn't meritorious of consideration, because if it was, then the procedure would latch on, and you would be given the opportunity to put forward your argument. But clearly, your arguments weren't strong enough.
In general, Carl, I would agree with your big picture points. I think the reason this High Court judgment got the criticism it did is it was a big shock to us, because we've been told by the government and by everybody that whatever we decided would stand, and we found through that judgment that it didn't. And as I say, when it went to the Supreme Court, it was a split decision. Carl, I thank you for your call. Pauline Clark on Facebook says, no way. They should be criticised when they make mistakes or try to interfere in Brexit. Text, dear Nigel, judges are people, not gods, and that comes from Sue. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show exclusively here on LBC. It's 7:30 and time for the news with Rupert Bartier.
The Nigel Farage Show on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Well, Lord Neuberger, our senior judge in the country, thinks it's wrong and unfair that he's been criticised and politicians didn't defend him. But before we get back to that, President Trump has just finished a press conference in Washington where he launched an extensive attack on the US media, saying the level of dishonesty is out of control. Trump also attacked the media for what he calls fake news and criticised the amount of government information being leaked. Let's listen to him.
I called Mexico. It was a very, very confidential, classified call, but I called Mexico. All of a sudden, it's out for the world to see. It's supposed to be secret. Same thing with Australia. All of a sudden, people are finding out exactly what took place.
Well, in politics, things do leak, and he intends to deal with it. And I have to tell you, if I was working inside the White House and I'd leaked, I would not want the Donald finding out. And interestingly, this comes on a day when there's some fresh opinion polling out in America. And would you believe it, today's poll shows 55% of likely American voters now support what the president is doing. His support in the country is going up very rapidly. And those comments about the media that he keeps on making, very interesting. The same poll asked people, was the media in America biased against Trump or was it in his favour? And 48% of voters said the media are biased against Trump, with only 12% thinking the media favoured Trump in any way. Something really fascinating is going on out there. And I think much of the liberal media establishment are just losing the trust of the public in much the same way our established political class have lost trust. But there's one other thing that Trump said in this press conference that I really think is worth thinking about.
To drain the swamp of corruption in Washington, D.C., I've started by imposing a 5-year lobbying ban on White House officials and a lifetime ban on lobbying for a foreign government.
He said he'd drain the swamp, and he's just made an incredible start. Can you imagine a British government saying that anybody that had worked in Downing Street could not work for a foreign government or a lobbying company? Goodness me, very often, before they got to the end of Downing Street, they've signed a contract with somebody else to be in lobbying, and you can love Donald, you can hate Donald, but I tell you what, he's doing what he said he'd do. And on Monday, I'll be broadcasting from Michigan, one of the great swing states, where I'm going to be going there and talking to voters who traditionally actually had been Democrat, but decided they'd vote for this man on this agenda. Love him or hate him, he's doing what he said he'd do. Now, back to the question at hand. Are judges so important, so fundamental, that we shouldn't even be allowed to criticise them? David in Ealing, what do you make of that proposition?
Hello there, hi.
Hi.
Basically, I think you have to appreciate that criticism is completely different from intimidation, Nigel.
Yes.
And intimidation includes the idea that you are threatening the person that you are addressing. And I certainly haven't seen any sign of that in the news bulletins that you're discussing. So, I believe that the day that we abandon the ability for people to criticise the judiciary will be a very, very, very sad day for British democracy.
So you think Lord Neuberger basically has got this wrong today?
Absolutely wrong. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, David, very short call, but you couldn't be clearer, and thank you. Tweet here, Crown Court trials and above in this country should be televised. Well, that was the point I was making just about 20 minutes ago. I think they should. Text, the massive establishment backlash against Brexit shows the people require protection from them in the form of a written constitution. Judges are the establishment, Steve. Well, right or wrong, Steve, on that point, I guess they are the establishment, but I have to say that I am a convert now to the idea of us having a written constitution. It'd be much harder for Parliament to give away our sovereignty ever again if we enshrined it in some way. And your Facebook messages coming through. Keir Goldsmith says, not if they do something wrong, but all they did was to make sure the process of exiting the EU was being carried out correctly and according to the law. Just because the majority voted to leave doesn't mean you abandon the process. Keir, I get your point, but my point is we were upset because we were told that whatever we decided would stand. Ben Tucker says, Big Brother courts, is that what you want? Vote to decide. Is Nigel guilty or not? £1 a phone call. Well, I can tell you that the new Musical Express, the NME, have today appointed me Villain of the Year, and I've beaten Donald Trump. I'm NME's Villain of the Year, and when this show is over, I'm going to go out and celebrate on the back of that. Caroline Laws on Facebook says, anyone can be criticised, but to put judges on the front page saying enemies of the state was just plain ridiculous. There seems to be, Caroline, a fair bit of agreement through all means, phone calls, your texts and tweets and Facebook messages. Everybody seems to think that headline was perhaps a little over the top. I wonder what Martin in Watford makes of this.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
I just want to make 3 points, if I may. One, why don't you broaden the debate, not only for MPs criticising judges and their decisions, but the ordinary person, not man, but the ordinary person in the street has the right to challenge a judge's decision. And I'll tell you why. There have been so many decisions that have been made by judges which are crass stupid, and they've been challenged, and where they've given paltry sentences, that judge has been reprimanded and had to renew his judgment, and in fact became a proper sentence. So therefore, people have the right to
Quite right.
judges. Judges, you see, are not God. They put themselves up to be, but they are ordinary folks trying to interpret the law. Therefore, because they do that, they can be wrong. And because they can be wrong, everyone has the right to challenge a judge. That's my first point.
Martin, you only get... this is only an hour's show, and I'm going to let you make that one point because you've made it beautifully, and other people want to get involved. But, Martin, you've made the point. They're human, they make mistakes, and through criticism, sometimes you can actually get a very bad judgment to be looked at again and perhaps changed. And I'm going to give you, Martin, in a moment, an example of that, and I thank you for the call. And I wonder what Jamie in Chester... Jamie, you're a barrister, I understand.
I am, Nigel, yes.
Yeah, so was it wrong to call the judges, the High Court judges, enemies of the people?
Yes.
Right, OK. But should people be able to criticise judges in some form?
Yes.
Right, OK.
Do you want me to make the distinction?
Please do.
There is a clear distinction. Judges are not expressing their opinion when they rule on matters like the Supreme Court case. They are applying the law. And very often, judges will come to conclusions on the law that goes against their opinion of what the law should be, but they are bound to apply the law.
Yep.
You can criticise their application, their reasoning on the law, all you want. I do it regularly in my job.
Yep.
Criticising them solely because they've reached a decision that you don't like or a decision that is inconsistent with your beliefs, and criticising them in a personal manner by saying things like enemies of the people is wholly unacceptable. It's unacceptable for media outlets to do that, and my understanding of the way that you put across your disagreement with the decision is that was also put across in a way that's unacceptable. Now, I say that with the caveat that I read in various news outlets your reaction to the High Court ruling.
Yes.
And I didn't see any criticism from you on the basis of the reasoning of the decision, just the decision itself. So correct me if I'm wrong.
No,
you didn't appear to criticise them on that basis.
No, my primary point, Jamie, was about Lord Thomas. That was my primary point. My secondary point, which you could argue round the houses, was that we'd use royal prerogative to get into the Treaty of Rome. Why couldn't we use it to get out? But my primary point was that I didn't really think one of those judges should have been part of that decision.
Well, I understand that. I disagree with you on that, but I understand the point you make. Of course, it's important that the judiciary needs to be independent. And if you have a concern that, for whatever reason, Lord Thomas wasn't, then it's fair enough you express that. But in the aftermath of that decision in the High Court, you were talking about leading a march on the Supreme Court.
Well, this got wildly exaggerated and was a point put out by an over-enthusiastic press officer, which I slapped down immediately. There were protests outside the Supreme Court. Both sides were there protesting, but I chose, Jamie, to take no part in that.
Okay, well, it was reported in the media.
I know.
If that's wrong, then it's wrong.
Yeah.
I can't
We
do that either way.
We could almost call it fake news. Jamie, thank you. You made your points beautifully. Jeff Ringham says on Facebook, yes, we should have the right to challenge judges. At the end of the day, they judge the law according to their own subjective opinion. Considering these judges are old people, many of whom are locked into old ways of thinking, this is because they don't live in the real world. I remember my 10-year-old once saying, Dad, it's not fair. I'm getting marked down at school. I said, do you realise my teachers are so old, some of them are even 50? Well, here's 52-year-old Nigel Farage saying you're listening to his show exclusively here on LBC, and it's 7:45.
Leading Britain's conversation. LBC, The Nigel Farage Show.
Oh, yes, we should be able to criticise judges, and here's why. Here's why, and it's a story that involves free speech, and it's a story, I'm pleased to say, that involves LBC. Because if we go back to 2012, Judge Peter Bowers said he was going to take a chance on burglar Richard Rochford, who raided 3 homes in 5 days, telling him it takes a huge amount of courage, as far as I can see, for someone to burgle somebody's house. Shall I just say that again? Judge Peter Bowers said it takes a huge amount of courage, as far as I can see, for somebody to burgle somebody's house. Well, as you can imagine, there was a bit of a furore. And David Cameron, the Prime Minister, quite rightly said that burglars were not brave, but they were cowards, and their crimes were hateful. And the Lord Chancellor, Chris Grayling at the time, and the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Judge, considered his comments to have damaged public confidence in the judicial process. And they said this in response to one of the complainants, who was a certain Nick Ferrari of the LBC Breakfast Show. Anyway, as a result of all of this, Judge Bowers was issued with a formal reprimand. OK? So Nick Ferrari, on his show, openly criticised the judge, along with others, and the Lord Chancellor and others said, do you know what? This criticism is just, it's right, and it's fair. It's outrageous what this judge has said. What signal is that sending to people in this country? And he got a formal reprimand, and I'm certain if he ever did it again, he probably would have finished being struck off. So we have to be able to criticise, but, and I take some very intelligent calls and points we've had tonight, not to undermine the independence of the judiciary, or to be seen to be moving towards a country where the executive, the government, could influence judges' decisions. And I think that is really, really important. Barbara Birch on Facebook says, if you can't question judges' decisions, you might as well go and live in North Korea, where you can't criticise anything. Well, you can always leave North Korea and get murdered at an airport, as happened, of course, just today. Steve in Worthing, is it right that judges should, at times, be criticised?
You mean enemies of the people?
Well, that's what some thought.
That's a bit inflammatory, isn't it? No. Right, yeah. I mean, yes, they absolutely should be criticised. And with regard to the law, I mean, the laws in this country, you know, are seriously at fault and need to be changed. I mean, you've got a situation, depending on one part of the country, you know, a law will be passed, or judgment will be passed one way, and another part of the country it will be passed totally differently. You know, I think you've got a lot of these laws are out of date, and I would say with regard to the law, not just the judges, you know, they've done a very good job legally protecting people like Abu Hamza, Anjam Chowdhury, you know, but what about, we've got, as I understand it, 3,000 cases of female genital mutilation. You know, what's the law and the judges done to sort of protect them also?
Well, they have to have proof, Steve, don't they? I mean, you know, somebody can be accused of something, but you have to have absolutely incontrovertible proof, and a jury has to be persuaded of that as well.
Yeah, okay, fair enough, but it is appalling that we've got a situation, you know, I believe that the majority of them have been sent to Pakistan where they've had this done, although, you know, allegedly some of it's actually happened over here. But I remember not so long ago,
It was stated there was about 100 cases. Then it went up to 1,000.
I know.
And now it's 3,000. This is appalling.
Steve, the law is not perfect, and you talked about Abu Hamza, who, of course, invoked the human rights law that much of which we inherited, and in fact maybe enhanced from the European Union, and maybe getting back an independent judiciary will, medium to long term, be one of the benefits, Steve, of us getting out of the European Union. Liz Weston says if judges are always right, then there would never be a court of appeal, and miscarriages of justice couldn't possibly ever happen. Robin Pearce says if the High Court judges are genuinely concerned about parliamentary sovereignty, then why do they want to stall Brexit, which will restore parliamentary sovereignty? Well, Robin, it's gone now. And I've just got one here. You can love Donald, you can hate Donald, but he's doing what he said he'd do. Comes in by tweet. Connor in Hull. Were these judges enemies of the people, or was that completely over the top and, in fact, maybe an attack on the independence of the judiciary?
Hi there. First off, congratulations on the NME Award.
Thank you. I'm delighted.
Very impressive.
Best thing that's happened to me for a long time.
Yeah. No, I'm very impressed. I think the idea that decisions of judges are somehow sacrosanct and that you're not allowed to criticise it is absurd. As you say, these journalists are not the government. They are free-born citizens, and they should be free to say whatever they choose to, and they are protected by freedom of speech, especially when what they're saying is true. They are enemies of the people. The people are ultimately the sovereign power in this country. We made a decision, and the government was simply trying to enact it. This isn't about the independence of the judiciary. Judges have not been acting independently in this country for some time now. You always see them...
Do you really feel that, Connor? Do you really...
Yeah. You see them reaching these crazy decisions that clearly reflect their own prejudices and priorities rather than an honest and dispassionate application of the law. The judiciary are very often the enforcers for political correctness, which is completely at odds with the views of most normal people. They, for example, they'll routinely allow dangerous foreign criminals and illegal immigrants to stay in the country because they had a kid or married another illegal immigrant or bought a kitten or whatever.
Well, Connor, isn't this?
Sure.
Didn't a lot of this happen because we were members of the European Union and we saw European law being incorporated into British law and being enshrined in a Human Rights Act? And don't we now have the opportunity with Brexit to get rid of some of this stuff?
I would agree with you there, but I think it's part of a wider... the spread of political correctness has gone into all the institutions. It's not just the judiciary.
Right. Connor, I'm losing you, but I get your point. The world's become too politically correct, including our judiciary. That's what Connor from Hull says. What does Nikki from Mill Hill have to say on this?
Hi, Nigel.
Hello.
I don't think... I think the judges need to have accountability, which they don't have. They may have independence, but there isn't genuine external accountability, which is what's needed, because they're not above criticism and they mark their own homework in the way in which their processes are configured. So when your previous callers suggested that, you should go through the procedure, well, they're going to say that because they know that that's where that's leading to. They divide the fact that the kind of decision that the logic that the judge uses versus his own personal prejudices.
Yeah.
But often those two are interlinked.
And it is fair to say, Nikki, that the law is complicated and there is perhaps, in many cases, more than one reasonable interpretation, isn't it?
Exactly. So if it's not black and white, what has to be done, it's the interpretation.
Yes.
Most of it is interpretation.
Yeah. Well, Nikki, I'm not pretending they've got an easy job at all. They certainly haven't. But I do think if they really get it wrong, we should be able to criticise them. Nikki, thank you. And my last caller this evening is Jay from Tottenham. Jay, should we be able to criticise judges?
Oh, of course we should. And as a member of the public, it's obscene to suggest otherwise, frankly. But in the judge's defence, I should say, as someone who's a Master of Law student,
yep.
When it comes to any kind of judicial proceeding, judges have essentially four methods in which they're allowed to interpret laws. So this is a very quick legal lecture for your audience. But the first method is what's referred to as the literal interpretation, where you read the law almost like a contract, if you like. So you read the law exactly as it said. So it's the kind of...
I'm going to have to hurry you, Jay. I'm going to have to hurry you. You've got 25 seconds to make your point.
Okay, well, I'll be quick then. The second one is what's called the mischief rule, where the judges take a subjective interpretation of the law to see what kind of mischief it was meant to undermine. And then there's the fourth one, which is known as parliamentary interpretation, which is where you look to what Parliament wanted to undermine by introducing the statute and then making your decision on that basis.
Given the complexity of this, Jay, would it be simpler for us to have a written constitution? Would that make things a bit clearer?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, without any question at all.
Terrific. Jay, I'm going to have to let you go. You were the last caller this evening. I thank you. Great phone calls, lots of text, tweets and Facebook messages. And my final thought is simply this. Yes, the independence of our judiciary is crucial. It's sacrosanct. But if a judge clearly has an interest in a case, he or she should not be sitting in judgment. That was why I criticised what came out of the High Court originally on the Brexit ruling. But we must be able to criticise judges as Nick Ferrari did, and the man got reprimanded. And let's televise our courts and make it all more accountable. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'm back on Monday at 7 o'clock live from Michigan. Coming up at 10, it's Ian Collins. But up next, it's Clive Bull.
Thank you, Nigel. And coming up, Donald Trump has launched an unprecedented attack on the media, saying the level of dishonesty is out of control. So I'm asking, who's telling the truth, the media or the president? Also to come...